Sunday, Mayfest 50th anniversary, and that's at Trinity Park. Now I'm going to call on Chief Neil Noakes, and he's going to introduce a new commander.
Mayor and Council, I always enjoy being in front of you to discuss important issues, but this is one of the ones that's definitely a delight for me, is to introduce new members of the appointed command staff. We recently had an opening for the commander in East Division, which is an extremely important division within the city of Fort Worth, just as all the other divisions are. We've got some really unique communities in East Division that make it so special. We made some great relationships, and we're making even more strides when building those relationships and dealing with any of the issues that those valued community members are dealing with. So for me, picking a commander had to be someone not only that was a servant leader, someone who understood that the position wasn't about them, it was about the community, it was about the department, and understanding that really they've got a department of their own, if you will. Each division is like a smaller department, and quite frankly, those departments, if they were their own independent, would be larger than most of the other agencies in the country, especially the ones in North Texas. So it's not a small task to take on a division like this. I wanted someone that had the right heart. I wanted someone that had the right experience, but even more importantly, someone with the right potential. Someone that I see as an up-and-comer that's going to do great things in the department, but also someone who knows East Division. We interviewed 12 different applicants who showed interest in the position, and one rose to the top, in my opinion, well above the rest. Not that the others weren't good candidates, but all the qualities I was looking for were there. In addition, Commander Monica Martin happened to go to school in East Division, live in East Division, attends church in East Division. She knows the division well. She is already a part of the community over there. It's with great pleasure that I introduce to you the newest commander of East Division, Commander Monica Martin.
Thank you, Chief Noakes, for the introduction. As he said, I am an East Sider. Just to give you a brief history, I am from Overton, Texas, which is East Texas. We moved here and stayed on the east side of Fort Worth, graduated from Eastern Hills, did some of my career on the east side of Fort Worth, have gone on to several different various units within the department, only to come back to the east side, which is home for me. I don't take the challenge lightly. I look forward to the opportunity to working with the community, council members, and the police department to bridge gaps. I think it's very important that we know that the East Side community needs to have a voice. I've already met with several key stakeholders, and we're on the ground running, trying to bridge those gaps. So I am truly excited and humbled that Chief saw that in me, that dedication and that commitment to want to grow with the community.
That's great. Thank you.
If I could add just one more thing, Commander Martin she's got it up here and she's got it in here. And I need someone who has both, and she does. And one thing that's important to note, and it's something I did not even realize until after the appointment, when we were going to the promotion ceremony, somebody asked me, is she one of the higher ranking black females in the department? I said, well, let me ask our police historian and find out. Not only is she the only appointed female in any appointed position in the history of the Fort Worth Police Department, she is the highest ranking black female ever in the history of the Fort Worth Police Department. I think it's important to know that's not why she was selected. I didn't even realize it when the selection was made. She has it just because she earned it, but that must be celebrated. So congratulations to her.
Congratulations, Monica.
Thank you, Chief. I think she had that east side part down. All right, we have a number of informal reports. The first one is the February 2022 sales tax update, and Mark McAvoy is available if there are any questions. All righty, the next informal report is an update on transit partnership projects with COG, Trinity Metro, and TxDOT. And Kelly Porter is available if there are any questions.
Kelly, can you come and just give a very brief summary of what we're doing? Because there has been a lot of changes, and I want to make sure that everyone on council.
That's not Kelly. Good.
My name is Mary Elliott, and I'm here on behalf of Kelly Porter. So we have 4 regional partnerships that we wanted to bring to your attention. COG intends to submit a grant application on behalf of the city and the region to support TxDOT's East Lancaster Corridor project. COG will be requesting $100 million. That's in addition to the Regional Transportation Council's commitment of $40 million. And TxDOT is committed to $10 million. And our local match will be $16.4 million. This is a reconstruction of East Lancaster Avenue from Dottie Lynn Parkway to downtown. And the goal is to reconstruct the road as a multimodal, context-sensitive, and economically vibrant smart corridor. The next regional partnership is with COG, Trinity Metro, and the city for the TexRail extension. There's a new near South Side station being proposed, which will be a 2.1 mile commuter rail extension that will connect Fort Worth's T&P station with the near South Side Medical District. The improvements include 1 new rail station with park and ride with 100 parking spaces. It'll be located near the Baylor, Scott, and White All Saints Medical Center, as well as 8th Avenue shops and restaurants. So the medical district employs about 40,000 potential riders, so it's a very good opportunity for an extension of the system. It's also a partnership with the private sector as well, because Baylor, Scott, and White tend to extend sidewalks, improving connectivity along Leslie Street and Mistletoe Boulevard. Fort Worth will be expanding the sidewalks to the west, and Trinity Metro has selected this site as a future site for a bike sharing station. All of the TexRail trains and stations are bike friendly. In addition, Mistletoe Boulevard, the railroad crossing will be made safe for pedestrians. So in all of our partnerships with COG and Trinity Metro on TexRail extensions, it increases the potential for transit-oriented development, which is walkable, connects to different mixed uses, provides for high density, and specialized retail that serves commuters as well as locals. There is another TexRail opportunity where the North Central Texas Council of Governments is working with Trinity Metro on the Trinity Lake Station. So the RTC is committed to providing $26.5 billion approximately in federal funds and $5.3 million in transportation development credits to creating a station as well as parking and a road connecting the station to Trinity Lakes Boulevard. So the station is soon to be under construction, and it hope to have it complete by June of 2023. The next regional partnership is with COG and Trinity Metro. The city is actually not providing money towards this specific project, but we are expressing support. The RTC will provide $16 million in funding to a guaranteed transit service program. And the purpose of this program, it will refund any customer who has a late arrival on the Bus Express service that uses the managed lanes between downtown, the managed lanes on I-35 between downtown and the Alliance Corridor. So all of these projects are opportunities to create partnerships with other entities and to leverage funding from other sources. So in the case of East Lancaster, the city participation would be 11%, and for the TexRail extension, it would be 4.3%. So for every dollar that the city spends, that will leverage $13 in other funding sources from federal sources through COG and the U.S. Department of Transportation, Trinity Metro, TxDOT, as well as private participation. So, any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you. The next informal report is on employee diversity or employment diversity, and Deanna Giordano is available if there are any questions. All right. Next is our public-private electric vehicle charging station program. And William Johnson and Steve Cook are available if there are any questions. All right. William, Steve. We got William.
Afternoon. Good afternoon, William. Thanks for coming up. You know, in reading the report, you and I have spoken, on and off about this here. I'm fully supportive of exploring new technologies that can help us, save costs in the long run. I mean, EVs right now are receiving lion's share of the attention. But there are some infrastructure-related issues that sort of temper, the full adoption, of EVs. We have vehicles that, are of a heavy-duty nature, that EVs, so far right now are only coming into their own to start to be viable replacements for them. The upfront costs on average, for your average, car or truck, it's about $10,000 more. Not really sure what federal grants are available to help the city defer the cost. The pervasiveness of EV charging infrastructure concerns me. The reliance right now on established dealer networks, for doing any kind of maintenance, to that effect. There also would be a first responder impact to that. I know the fire department has already, to some degree, trained to extricate, folks that are involved in accidents using the jaws of life if it's an electric vehicle, because there are implications there. These things, are of concern to me right now. We can't fully adopt it. We can take some steps. But I do remember in the past when prior councils had received updates, as far as the use of EV vehicles, they really didn't help us defer much of the costs. Since that time, there have been advancements in the technology, but I wanted to see if you could maybe at least speak to some of those items that I brought up.
Well, this particular IR is in reference to a private agreement that was reached between us and two service providers, where the initial upfront cost is going to be borne primarily by those private companies. We will also see, we also have some funding available through COG for on-street and EV charging stations at select locations where we have more flexibility in determining where we're going to locate them. In this case, with the private sector, the funding or the upfront cost is going to be covered by that private sector. With the COG, the funding that we receive from COG is what we'll be using, working with contractors to install EV charging stations at select locations. As far as the, federal funding to offset the costs for EV vehicles for individuals, I know that there are programs out there that help to reduce the cost, but one of the things that we're seeing in the marketplace is more and more automakers creating, electric versions of not some new hybrid vehicle that you got to go off and figure out what it is, but, there's electric versions of Mercedes-Benz, BMWs, Chevrolets, I think even Corvette now has an electric vehicle that's coming out. So Over time, we think that we're gonna see this increase. We think that as more and more infrastructure is out there, you'll see the cost coming down, and the auto industry seems to be embracing it. And what we're trying to do is kind of position Fort Worth where we're at least on the map in terms of being able to accommodate our citizens as any of them choose to transition into EVs. We recently adopted a clean fleet policy and a resolution to accept funding from COG for the locations that we're going to be designating with public dollars for infrastructure installation. Most of that's going to be at publicly owned facilities to allow for more diversity in terms of where you'll be able to access EV charging stations. And as people purchase EV vehicles, there are apps that they download now to tell them where they can go to get recharged.
All right. Thank you, William. I appreciate that information.
Thank you. Oh, go
Thank
ahead.
you.
William, could you just verify what portion of federal funds, if any, is participating in this?
Well, for COG, the COG grant is around between $90 and $100,000, right, for those locations. On the private side, it's all private money.
Just wanted to spell out that there was federal dollars being utilized for good purpose, so.
Yes.
Thank you, William. And then the final informal report is a pavement markings update, and Tanya Brooks is available if there are any questions.
I have some questions. How are you?
Afternoon, I'm good. How are you?
Good. So I had requested this IR because I had several constituents complain about the status of our street markings and whether or not that was a safety issue. I appreciate you putting together this IR, and I went back and looked at the previous IR that y'all had done, or the update, I'm sorry. And I have some concerns here about how we're going about this maintenance program based on the information that y'all have given us. So it says in the IR that we currently have an 8-year rolling maintenance program. So if we restripe an intersection or a street, we can reasonably anticipate that it will be 8 years until we get to that particular location again. Did I read that correctly?
That's correct.
Okay. But then the product that we're using has a 3-year lifespan. So that means that we have 5 years that we are not providing the safest particular markings for our residents. And I've started looking, and I look at a street that I travel every day, which is Trail Lake, and there are portions of what is a pretty busy street in this city where it's hard to tell where one side of the street, where one lane of traffic ends and the opposite lane begins. And at nighttime, it's even harder. And so for 5 years, we're doing our residents a disservice. And I understand that the budget is part of that process, and we've gotten a little more money to go towards that. But that seems like a pretty significant safety issue. And so I would charge you and Mr. Cook, as we're going through that budgeting cycle, to really look at whether or not we're providing the service that we need. I mean, there's streets downtown that you don't know where one lane ends and one lane begins. And we need to make sure we're doing better at that. So if 3 years is what the product lasts, then we need to have a 3-year schedule, or at least a 4-year, try to stretch it. But going 5 years over what is a 3-year project is about double, and that's not okay.
Can I just add on to that? This is about lanes, et cetera. We still have some speed bumps in the city that aren't marked or they fade, et cetera. And so I have neighbors in Overton Woods and others that have 5 down a street They know it because they live there, but people come through there, and obviously it's doing its job to slow people down, which speed bumps are doing. But what I would say is, I think people want to know the speed bumps are coming before they go over them, so they don't hurt their car. So if we could do that as well, that'd be great.
Okay, Carlos.
Tanya, I'm going to add to that too. And in fact, recently, this is a good example. There's some streets that are more heavily traveled than others, and there's some streets that have different surfaces. For example, there around the Stockyards area and the Marine area, you have brick pavers, right? And I noticed that there was a difference in how the longevity of the markings on those different surfaces. Case in point, there is a school crossing at North Main, 1400 block, North Main, and 14th Street. It seems that, you know, since I've been a council member, I have to call it in frequently to say the markings are faded. Back in 2020, for example, TPW did respond, put some additional signage there, and I think they addressed the markings. The markings are faded again. And that's within a 2-year period. So again, depends on the street surface, how heavily the streets are traveled. So, you know, again, it's already been said, you know, we have to look at those intervals and maybe factor in, you know, these things that I bring up as well. Because it, any more than 3 years, I think, is pushing it too far, you know, for certain streets that are heavy traveled, and people need to, you know, have those markings to guide them.
So Tanya, before I respond, I'm sure y'all know that's an issue. What's the perfect solution? And is there something you think in the future that we could be doing differently to help support your department in a quicker?
Right, the
fix
last
to
couple
this?
of years, I think it's mentioned in the IR, we have increased funding to get our cycle from a 10-year down to an 8-year cycle. In a perfect world, it would be a 3-year cycle, and that's funding increase. The cost for a 3-year cycle is about $8.7 million a year to maintain a 3-year cycle for our almost 9 million linear feet worth of pavement markings. And that also includes multimodal markings, including our crosswalks as well as our bicycle lanes.
Okay. Any other questions, council? No, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Tanya. Mayor, that concludes my report.
Great. Thanks, David. I think we can go into any upcoming zoning cases for next week. Any issues that you want to alert staff about, council? No? Any other city council action items for upcoming meeting? No? Then let's go into the Fort Worth Employees Retirement Fund update, and we'll start with David Cook, I think.
We've got a whole team. Come on up. Doesn't matter. I've never been over here before. This is odd. So we're about to launch into a discussion on the pension. And sometimes that could get a little dry. Was the turning down the lights intentional? All right. So let me thank everybody, and I'll introduce the folks that are at the other podium in just a second. But we wanted to take the time, particularly with the number of new council members, to dedicate some time to talk about the pension. And so what I tell you up front is we're going to try to go through it deliberately and at a level, hopefully, that everybody can follow along. Because what I learned a number of years ago is this is complex, it's complicated, and we want to impart as much information as possible. There's two primary reasons that the timing is appropriate. And the first one is every year you have a joint meeting with the Retirement Fund Board, and that comes at the end of this month. And so we wanted, again, the new council members to have a a broad understanding of the pension before that joint meeting takes place. That's one. And two, we'll talk next about the budget process, and one of the budget commitments that will be in next year's budget, just like it has in the last 3 years, is the recommended strategies to make the pension more sustainable over time. And so the budget that we'll be bringing forward this summer has the 5th year of essentially 5 years worth of recommendation strategies for implementation. And we'll talk about that. But what I want to encourage you is, as we walk through this, to stop us along the way, ask questions. And I'll go back to 2015. The council at the time asked me to put together a committee. We called it the Pension Review Task Force, to essentially evaluate the condition of the pension system at the time, and then to make recommendations so it will be sustainable over the long period of time. Again, that was back in 2015. That committee worked for 3 years, and it wasn't until December of 2018 that the council adopted the recommendations of that pension review committee, and that's what we've been implementing since that period of time. Let me do this as you'll see, we're going to spend some time on the history, and I think the history is kind of important because we didn't get here, or the council at the time in 2015 were put in the position of having to fix something that they did not create the problem. Does that make sense? You just happened to be the one sitting around the table at the time that had to deal with the situation that was years, perhaps decades in the making. And I think that's just one of those lessons perhaps for the council members is there's a lot of things that will come before us, and it's our job not to make that a future generation's problem. And so we've got to have a long-term perspective. We have to keep a long-term perspective. But I give the credit to the council at the time. They had to deal with solving a problem that they didn't create. And by dedicating the amount of money, and I'll show you in a minute the amount of money we're dedicating to solve the pension problem, that's money that wasn't able to go do other things, like reducing the pavement marking cycles for roads, because we had to plow tens of millions of dollars into fixing the pension problem at the time. So I just say that we'll spend some time on the history, because I do think it's important that we keep a long-term perspective in all the different things that we do, so we don't pass on to future generations problems they have to fix. Our consultants, going back to 2016, once we put that pension review task force together, we hired PFM. They have helped cities and counties throughout the country work through pension system issues and identify recommended solutions. And so today, and we've worked with them ever since, I have with us, I love this, Flick, raise your hand. Flick Fornia and Michael Nadal, again from PFM, and what I'll say is they're gonna do the majority of the presentation, and I'm simply color commentary. So I get to jump in like when I want to. Other than that, they're doing the presentation. You guys ready?
Ready.
All right.
So thank you for inviting us to present to you today. I'm Mike Nadal, and just to kind of get us underway, I'm going to start with some Pensions 101. The City of Fort Worth has a defined benefit pension program, as most of you know. That's the most common form of retirement income replacement in the public sector. You see that in about 85% of the state and local government sector. And it provides a certain benefit based on your years of service with the city and your income around the time of your retirement, your last several years of employment. in a fixed benefit that you receive for the rest of your life. And that's in contrast to what many of us have in the private sector, the general labor market, a defined contribution plan, a 401k style benefit, where you as a participant in that 401k and often your employer through a match or supplemental contributions put money into that 401k. And whatever is there at the time you retire, subject to investment returns, how much you contribute is what you have to retire on. So that benefit adequacy is kind of dependent on what you do as a member and how the markets do. With the defined benefit plan, it's really more of that certainty, but then the funding pressure falls to the program. Do you have enough money set aside? How do those investments play out in order to fund that fixed benefit for as long as the recipients may live? In terms of how that is managed and governed within the city of Fort Worth, it's really a shared set of responsibilities. So the city determines the funding policy, the rates by which the city and members contribute, but that's subject to member approval if there's going to be an increase in the members' contributions or a decrease in the city's contributions. But there's also a separate board of trustees that has appointees of the active participants in the plan, the retirees who are participating in the plan, and of course you all, city council, that administers the program, determines how the plan invests its assets, determines what actuarial assumptions are going to be used to determine how much money should be set aside to meet the long-term funding requirements of the program. And that staff has its own services that are kind of charged back to the pension program. It's a separate entity. It has its own pension plan that doesn't reflect some of the more recent reforms that have been part of the city's efforts to manage its costs. And then there's a state-level oversight to some degree through the Texas Pension Review Board that sets certain guidelines for funding public sector pension plans for all Texas local governments.
This is color commentary time. So I want to just highlight those bullets right there. The fund has a set of employees, and Reggie's one of our members that sits on that board, and the mayor and council, I believe, make some appointments. As benefits were increased over time, the staff of the fund got the benefit of all those increases. When the city employees took the benefit reductions, that never took place on the side of the fund's employees. So the employees that are administering our plan get the benefit of the old plan that we all had. And as we made the changes, I'm just saying they did not. Next.
So you've had this program in place for many years, since 1945. With that long history, you actually have a somewhat distinct structure from many local governments where you have all of your employees, general, police, and fire within the same plan. The benefits vary a little bit, mostly to reflect that public safety employees may retire a little earlier based on the physical and hazardous demands of their jobs. That makes their program, their part of the program, a little bit costlier. But the goal when you have this kind of defined benefit program is to set aside enough dollars during people's active years of service to pay for their benefits when they retire. And Flick will speak to that a little bit more and illustrate kind of how some of that mechanism works. But it's again, that defined benefit model. The last bullet I want to note on this slide is also important. Because your employees have this defined benefit structure and based on the history of your program dating back to the 40s, your employees are not covered in parallel by Social Security. So they're not contributing 6.2% of their pay for participation in Social Security. The city's not making that contribution. If your employees are to receive any Social Security coverage, it's only due to work they may have had before or after joining you. So this is the sole income replacement benefit associated with city service.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and thanks, David and Mayor and council members. I'm Flick Forney, I'm the actuary of the group, so I'm particularly annoyed that they turned the lights down, like you said.
Yeah.
I get to go through some of these numbers, and so, as Mike mentioned, the pension fund, you know, is just this separate entity. They have their own actuary. They prepare every year these actuarial valuation reports that determine how well you're funded and what their recommended contribution would be under various actuarial procedures. And I do want to comment on David's comment about the fund having a different benefit package than the rest of you. I worked with pension funds in New York and Austin and San Diego, Atlanta, Memphis, Denver, Kansas City, Omaha, dozens. And I've never, ever seen that where they don't take the hit, just like you guys took the hit, 5, 10, 15 years ago. Now, it's not a big deal because there's only a handful of people there, but it does create a disparity. I mean, maybe you didn't know this, David, but I was here in 2012, I think at this podium or that podium, I can't remember which, at one of these joint meetings with retirement funds. So you hadn't started fixing the problem very much yet. You did a lot more when you hired PFM and myself, and then Paul Schrader, another Texan actuary colleague of mine. Anyway, so here's how it works. The whole idea of the actual process is to try to figure out where these valves should be. You don't get to control the valve on the right, the investment earnings and loss. That's kind of, the market does that. And the market's been very good to us in the last 5 years, with the exception of the last 4 months. So the idea is you want to get the pension fund to a level where it's paid for on a current basis, where the current tax revenue, the current employees are paying for the benefits that they're currently earning. You're not in that situation. You're basically about 50% funded. That blue or brown fund is only about half of what the actuary thinks it should be. It's 52% of what the actuary thinks it should be. The actuary does projections of what the benefit payment valve is going to look like, and then the actuary makes projections of what that investment return valve is going to look like, and they're pretty good at estimating what the expenses are going to be. But so they're trying to figure out then what the valves should be for the employee and the employer. And right now that's done. They make their calculations, and then you've got a statute that says what you're going to put in. I think that's probably good enough at this point on this slide. So unless someone has a comment or question, let's go to the next slide. So this one, these are basically the numbers. So right now your payroll for everybody is $549 million, and in addition to that you're paying in wages, you're also having to pay $139 million to the pension fund, and $66 million or the members are paying to the pension fund. And David, you had a comment on this in terms of.
The $139 million is over 25% of our payroll has to go to pension each and every year. We're going to break that down on a later slide, but that's the equivalent, of 17 cents of the property tax rate simply goes to paying the city's contribution on pension.
Yeah, so these are significant numbers. Mike, did you want to comment on this before I went into a little more detail?
On this slide?
Yeah.
Sure. Well, this shows that the underfunding, the emptiness within that tank that Flick described, has really grown over the last 25 to 30 years. If you go all the way back to the early 1990s, you really were about full in the tank. You had enough set aside for folks' service up to that point, and were only contributing based on what you needed to put in to cover the current service of the folks on board at that time. But a number of things changed over the years since. To some degree, the benefits were enhanced, and while there were some improvements or increases to the members' contributions to cover a portion of those costs, and some increases to city contributions over those years, that created more exposure to investment return risk, because you had more benefits dependent on that money you're putting into the tank. And as the investment returns started to hit some choppier waters, first with the dot-com bubble in the early 2000s, later with the Great Recession in the late 2000s. The sort of roaring economic growth of the 90s that kept you well-funded kind of began to flip against you. Combined with the increased benefits, you see that after those red bars appear, those recession years that are associated with the downturns in the markets, in the wake of that, the underfunding, the shortfall in your pension program begins to grow and grow and grow. Compounding that, and you see these little green boxes at the bottom of this slide, you also, or the pension board also, adjusted its assumptions about what investments it could expect. That experience of adverse investment performance led the board to reevaluate how much they were assuming the money in that tank would grow through investment returns. And if you're not assuming it's going to grow as much, that means you're recognizing a greater shortfall today. You're not counting on something that the board no longer believes is going to be reliable and there for you. And that sort of doubles up the effects of the losses themselves.
I was just to articulate, back in the early 90s, with staff recommending it, council approval, the city reduced contributions, both from the city and from employees, while raising the benefit, the multiplier first from 2 to 2.5, then from 2.5 to 3, and made it retroactive to everybody who came before that. That means even if you retired under a different multiplier, you now receive the new multiplier. Does that make sense? That makes sense. I'm saying, so these seeds were sown back in the 90s, right? And that carried forward all the way then into the 2000s, when you now see the lines going up pretty dramatically. That's the unfunded liability that starts racing ahead.
David, not that it really matters, but I'm just curious, was that a trend that other pension funds, public pension funds across the country were taking those same kind of ill-fated actions, or were we an outlier?
I would say you were a bit of an outlier. Things were booming in the 90s. I mean, not everyone in this room remembers that, but you know, the actuary was assuming you'd earn 8%, and everyone knew their 401k was earning 12. So we really, really thought, and I say we, the actuarial community, the public pension community, that the good times were going to roll on forever. I don't recall too many systems that did what David described, where you even gave the retirees, you know, the person that had retired in 1988, you gave that person a retroactive benefit increase. That was fairly unusual. But certainly, I mean, California, gosh, that's one of the worst cases. They basically cut a deal where, you know, if we'll let you improve your benefits if you agree to reduce your contributions, basically. I mean, it's just, it was bad judgment, but yours was worse than average, I guess I would say. And so the last bar you saw was $2.2 billion high on that last chart. So your unfunded liability was negligible up until the dot-com bust in the beginning of this century, and then it just kept creeping up and up. And what this pie chart does is try to show where that $2.2 billion of unfunded liability come from, okay? And I'm gonna start with the biggest wedge, which is light green, just like the slide before. So that's where the actuaries said, wait a minute, we don't think we're gonna earn 8%. Maybe we're really gonna earn 7.75. Maybe we're really gonna earn 7.5, and now maybe we're really gonna earn 7. The actuaries also, but most of this is from that. Most of this is because you kind of raise the bar. You know, like I'm saving for retirement. If I think I'm gonna earn 8%, I don't have to save as much. Well, I don't save as much because I think I'm gonna earn 8%. If I only think I'm gonna earn 7, I save a little bit more. And that's the situation you're in. Plus, since so much of this liability is on your retirees that are in the past, you don't really have time to catch up for them. The other thing the actuaries did, and this was all the right decision, it's just that back in 1992, we thought we could earn a lot more than we think we can earn now, or 1995, I guess. The other thing the actuaries did is they realized people were living longer. Now we're not so sure that people are gonna keep living longer and longer, but certainly now people are living longer than we thought they were gonna live in 1995. So there's a little bit of that adjustment in there too. And then the red wedge at the bottom is the actual investment performance. So, from 1995 to 2012, you thought you were gonna earn 8.5. Well, you didn't. You earned less than 8.5 during that period. From 2012 to 2015, you thought you were gonna earn 8, and then so on. So every time you don't earn what you think you're gonna earn, it creates a new unfunded liability, and vice versa. What the gray bar is, or gray wedge, moving around clockwise, is you have a policy in effect that doesn't really, or didn't in the past in particular, really capture the growth in the unfunded liability. You were trying to pay it off over a 40-year period, and you're paying it off as an increasing percentage of payroll, so you're really getting behind. I don't want to get into too much detail, but if the actuary were to do a calculation of what your cost would be, including this year paying off the unfunded liability, there would have been a higher number. You didn't put in, you put in what the statute required, which is fine, but it does cause you to try to catch up later. And later, I guess, is kind of now. What the light blue wedge is these benefit adjustments that we just described, minus the painful benefit adjustments you made in 2018. Because remember, in 2018, as we're going to discuss, you kind of went the other way. You said we're in a little bit of trouble. We need to reduce future benefits to some extent. So that's the blue wedge is kind of a net, and then the actuaries would be thrilled with this one. But the darker green wedge is everything else. So basically everything else turned out about the way you expected. Only 5% or so of this whole pie is due to everything else. Most of it's due to these other segments. I'll take a question on this, or David or Mike, do you want to comment?
Yeah. So we can move ahead. So again, David was truth in advertising. This can be a little dry, but I'm gonna here just highlight $2.2 billion worth of reasons why this matters. That's the shortfall that the actuaries, as of the end of 2021, believe you face today based on all of their calculations. It's normal to have a liability. The liability is the amount that you expect to pay for your future obligations to folks who haven't retired yet or who've retired but are expected to live for many more years. But the unfunded component is the amount you should have set aside and don't. That's roughly 4 times the current city payroll for a year. And it's not only, only around 55% of what you ought to have set aside, it doesn't even cover the amount you should have set aside to pay for those folks who've already retired. You only have about 90 plus, just barely over 90% of the liability for folks who are already gone, no longer serving the city at all, provided for. So why is that important? It's effectively debt of the city. It affects your credit rating, and it needs to be paid down. And you're contributing more every year to pay it down than you would be contributing if you were just funding the current service for those folks who are here serving the people of the city today. Currently, you're on a 37-year paydown trajectory, which is longer and slower than you would ideally want to see. But even with that, again, you're contributing significantly to pay down that debt, to pay down that shortfall. And you see that on the next slide, where we highlight the difference between the oh, absolutely.
At what rate of return is that assumption for the 37 years?
That's based on the current board's 7% rate of return
7%.
assumption.
Okay.
So, and if you were to believe that the fund might not even get 7%, you'd be on a slower path. If you think the fund could do better than that, it could be a little faster, and that's part of the recalibration that happens from time to time.
Okay, so do they
projected out at a flat 7%, or is there some kind of blended average?
They just assume that every year they're gonna assume
Projection
they're
is
gonna earn
7. Yeah.
With one exception, council member, you've got, the assets are very volatile, as we all know. I don't know what the market's done today, but April was a disaster. You know, 2021 was pretty good. And so what they do is, it's called actuarial smoothing, where they don't immediately recognize the great returns or the bad returns. They spread it out over 5 years. And the good news is you've got a little bit of a cushion here because we had over the 5 years preceding January 1st, 2022, those were pretty good. So you could take a pretty bad hit this year. We've calculated that even if if the fund lost about 2% this year, which is sadly a reasonable possibility, you know, you'd still be about even. So there's a little bit of built-up excess. There's an additional amount of assets that are not recognized in that 37-year calculation. But sadly, looks like we're going to be using it up this year.
Thank you.
So this slide highlights some of the different elements of the contributions that the city is making or is actuarially determined that it should be making, and the amount that the members are contributing. And there's a concept in the actuarial lingo called a normal cost. A pension normal cost is the amount that you would be contributing today for current service to have that tank be full when your current employees retire, without taking into account any past shortfalls, any underfunding that may have occurred in prior years. So that's just the kind of forward-looking, here's what we need for current service. That amount, based on all of the assumptions, that 7% assumption and assumptions about how long people will live, all of those factors, is just over 17% of pay. On average, and it varies a little bit for police and fire and general employees, on average in 2021, your employees were contributing just over 11%, leaving you about a 6% net normal cost for the city. If you had zero underfunding, that's what you would be paying. Instead, by statute, this year with risk sharing, you're contributing over 25% pay. So you're grossing up employee pay by almost 20% to cover these past liabilities, this historical underfunding that you're trying to pay down over 37 years. Actuarially, you can see just how much bigger, if you were paying all of it, and you're not even, you know, paying it down at the rate the actuaries would like to see you do it, it really dwarfs the amount needed for current service. So it's a very significant kind of overhang on the city's financing of its pension liabilities. Just a note here that, as I mentioned earlier,
You had a question, Carrie, sorry.
Oh, sure.
Go ahead, Carrie.
This is just so exciting, so I just wanted to jump in while I could. And that's with y'all leaving out half of the drama. Go back to slide 9. So just some attaboys, I guess. What was the unfunded liability 12/31/2018?
What was it?
Yeah,
Go back about 3 more slides.
3.2?
Yeah, it was also about 2.
What was it? Okay,
I think you were
2017.
Yeah, but I think, Carrie, to your point, what you're going with, I think wasn't that a projected unfunded liability
Yeah,
if
it
we
would've
did
been like
nothing
that.
in 2018?
Yeah,
The line would have been like that.
Right.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. I think the measures we took was a difference of about 700 million, and what I'm seeing now through 12/31, it's about $1 billion improvement on where we would have been. You were kind of getting into it on the next slide, what I was going to say about the funding rate. To me, I guess, the 25%, will that go down? That will go down over the years as some of those older employees fall off, correct?
Not much. I mean, it mostly, it's designed to stay level for 37 years. It's designed that you're gonna pay that amount for 37 years, then it'll crater when you're completely caught up.
Okay. And then the assumed rate of return being at 7%, we lowered that a couple of years ago.
We, the pension fund did.
Yep, yep. And given the returns we did last year, do we have an option? I would think we do, to increase that to 7.25, maybe even 7.5.
Why don't I take this? No. The returns you earned last year, you're gonna recognize those. You recognize them over 5 years. It's the forward-looking. It's where are we from today on? And one could argue that since you already earned a bunch, you're gonna earn less going forward. Certainly that's the way it works on a bond, for example. So, no, it's, the only likelihood I would see that the fund actuary and the fund would recommend increasing their 7 is if inflation really takes off and
That's
the
where I was
bond
going
market,
next.
and the bond market thinks it's gonna stay there.
That's where I was going next.
Yeah, right now, the bond market doesn't think it's gonna be that high.
Okay.
So,
Because I felt like inflation would help hedge that increasing that to 7.25, 7.5, and then that solves the challenge where we're going on the next slide with the state pension board, that, you know, fourth mayor and council needs to be prepared to address with them, that we don't need them to change the funding requirement from even beyond, they're talking about going to 25 years. And so our offset to that, to me, is increasing the assumed rate, which I think we can justify to 7.25, 7.5, so.
yeah, I beg your pardon, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. I don't think you can justify it, and I don't believe the fund's actuary thinks you can justify it. Unless inflation ticks up and stays up long enough for which would be a much worse problem in other arenas.
We will share in a
yeah.
few slides some information about national trends in terms of setting those investment return assumptions. Clearly, most of those trends developed prior to the recent spike in inflation. So the councilman absolutely bears monitoring. That will, as Flick noted, ultimately be the pension board's decision, where you have employees, but appointees, but where they're also appointees of the actives and the retirees. But the trend has been actually to continue lowering those assumptions, and we'll just have to see in this current volatile economy, you know, where do things sort of stabilize and what's reasonable from there. But we'll share that in a few more slides.
And keep in mind that members of mayor and council do a joint meeting with them as well, and I think we've had significant influence on the decisions made by that board over the last 7 years, so.
Well, let me also mention that if you're right, let's say that we really are gonna earn 7.5 instead of 7, you know, that'll trickle through. And you've still got 37 more years before, so maybe you'll be fully funded in 30 years instead of 37. But you won't have lowered your rate yet.
I just had a quick question. Maybe help me better understand all the moving parts here, and maybe others as well who may be watching. But I'm just kind of curious to better understand the unfunded liability is a number at a moment in time, right? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So that's our obligation, that's our debt. Now, correct?
Correct.
So,
Or it's an estimate, the actuary's best calculated estimate of your liability of your debt, effectively debt.
our ability to pay that can change based on performance of the fund in any given year. Is that the right way to think about it?
Well, the amount can change.
The amount could change.
I mean, your
and-
ability doesn't change, but.
So,
What our benefits paid are, the benefits paid can depend on the life expectancy of those receiving the benefit. Fair enough?
Substantially. You do have a fixed employer contribution based on statute. So there are some systems around the country where the employer contribution floats every single year because they pay it
Correct.
depending on what the actuaries recommend. Here, you might think of it as delayed a little bit in that over the years, you've tended to increase the city contribution as part of addressing the shortfall. But on a year-over-year basis, your contribution is also fixed. Ultimately, somebody's going to have to pay for the benefits, though. And
Yeah.
those benefits that have already been accrued are constitutionally protected by the state constitution. Or at least that's how the lawyers generally interpret it.
So for those listening, is it a little misleading to say it's unfunded, meaning you can't afford to do it, right? Is that the way we should interpret that?
I like to interpret it as how much you're behind.
How much
You
you're
know,
behind?
You think you should have, what was it, 4.7 billion, but you've really only got 2.5.
Right.
Therefore, and I don't recall if those are the precise numbers, but
Which
it's like when
could-
I'm saving for retirement, I want to have a certain
Yeah.
amount. If I've got less, that's kind of like an unfunded liability.
Okay, but that number could change, as we were saying, with performance of the fund. So that it's fluid, right?
It will change, yes.
It will change. And so that's what I mean. It's a little misleading to say, hey, the number's big, we get it. But it's not that we can't afford to pay it or over time with given performance expectations, all the actuarial things we're talking about, you'll be able to do this.
Yes, and you are paying it down.
Right.
Prior to the reforms that the city manager helped guide and council adopted in 2018, you actually had an unlimited period where you weren't contributing enough to ever pay it down. We'll show in one of the next few slides, you were actually going to have the funds drain away. Today, you are incrementally chipping away at it. It's just going to take, based on the current best estimates, 37 years, and it's costing you a ton to do it.
Yeah, okay. All right, thank you.
And I think we will talk about what the amortization timeframe is, whether it's a best practice, whether the Texas Pension Review Board looks at it, and that's your lead-in. Here we
Yep,
go.
and that's where we are. So the Pension Review Board, for plans that are running into difficulty, having shortfalls emerge today, based on recent legislation from just last year, requires that pay down happen within 30 years, or else they require a plan to correct that. Prior to that legislation last year, there was a 40-year time period to pay it down. You are under a 40-year funding soundness restoration plan period, and you're grandfathered. So you're compliant with what the Pension Review Board is looking for, but you're also taking a little longer to get there than they would recommend or require of a plan newly running into that kind of a shortfall. This is really just kind of for reference, some of their requirements for those types of restoration plans. So here,
Hold on a second. I've been waiting here to ask a question, so before we move on. What is the effective contribution rate for the city right now?
with risk sharing, I think it's 25.44%.
25 point what?
44%.
44%, okay. I'm comparing it to a snapshot back in the March timeframe of last year. Again, to Leonard's point about these are snapshots in time. And at the time, the member contribution rate was about, I think, 11% then. So,
That's the employee's contribution, not
Correct.
the employer.
Yes.
Yeah.
yeah, the members, yes. So, I think that's coming up in a couple of slides. But then we were told about goals that we, to give us an idea if we were on track where we wanted to be by 2048. And at the time, we were told that the city needs to contribute 30% to the pension plan. And then we had asked what the member contribution ought to be to make the 2048 goals. So I think the answer was then 16% of pay to provide benefit to employees. So I guess what I'm looking for, and we can wait till those slides come up, how are we in terms of that path to goal to 2048? How are we now, today?
We'll get to that.
Yeah, we do have a slide on that.
All right.
I think I grabbed this one.
All yours.
So, real quick, all this slide is intended to show is during that period of time, during 1990s through 2018, there were increases to contributions on the city side. That's the top slide. But the employee contributions or the member contributions were flat during that entire time. And I'll get to what we did in 2018 in just a second. The other change that the city council made back in about 2011 was the first change to a benefit and reducing the multiplier from 3 to 2.5. So that occurred in 2011 for general employees, 2012 for, I think, police, and then 2014 for fire, right? So that was the first change to the benefit. Then we get to 2018, and Councilmember Flores, I think this is what you're referring to. In asking to put together a pension review committee, we essentially had to make people aware that there was a problem to solve. There was a lot of people that didn't think we had a problem that needed to be solved. And so we use this chart fairly often just to make that statement. It wasn't whether we were going to run out of money or not. It was when, right? Because the benefits were far outpacing the amount of money that was paying for those benefits. And so we could change the discount rate and what the fund would earn. So it's just a matter of were we going to run out in 2048 or before? So real quick, I won't go through all the details. In 2018, we put together a series of recommendations that the council approved. Our goal at the time, when you think about it, is we were going to go to a 30-year amortization. So our goal was 30 years. We were using a 7.5% discount rate at the time because the pension board was still at 7 3/4. So our goal was 30 years at 7.5%. And to make those changes, it required the city putting in more money or the taxpayers putting in more money. And that was a 4.5% increase on payroll, contingent on a member vote, and I'll cover that in a second. It included reductions in the benefit, and it included increases in member contributions. But for member contributions to increase, the members have to vote for the increase. And if you remember, for those of you there, it wasn't a majority of the folks that voted. It had to be a majority of employees, period, right? Which meant that anybody who didn't vote is a no, right? So think about it. We had to get employees to go out and vote, and we had to get employees to go out and vote in favor. At the time, we had roughly 6,600 employees. We got over 74% of the employees to go vote. So a little over 4,900 voted. 3,920 voted in favor, which means essentially 3/4 of who voted in favor. So I do think the city did a pretty good job of, I think the way we sold it was, we either going to go out of money or we don't. Which one do you want? And so I think, but it was a very if you remember, very challenging time, but the employees came forward, voted in favor. We have now implemented the fourth year of the 5 years of the recommendations. So if you see on the far right box is the fifth year that's still to come, and that is the risk sharing, because we didn't hit 30 years. And so we said if we didn't hit our targets, the risk sharing automatically goes into effect. And the risk sharing means that we're gonna contribute 2% more to the fund. That's 1.2% from the employer or taxpayers, and then 0.8 from employees. So that'll go into place in fiscal year '23. This is the line I wanted to get to. If you see that blue line, that was what we were shooting for. So, Councilmember Moon, this kind of goes back. So we were going to hit the 30-year, and at 7.5%, we have actually exceeded what got put into place. That's the peach line. We'll call it peach. But by the retirement fund changing the discount rate to 7, that moves us up to the green line. Positive, when it's going down, that's positive, right? So we're on the right trajectory, but we won't hit the 30-year mark until you see farther out. If we do better on investment returns, that line will come down. If we do worse on investment returns, that line will go up. Back to you guys.
Just wanted to add before having Flick address some of the questions about the investment return assumption, that you can think about the pre-2018 period and what's happened since, again, to some degree with that visual of the tank that Flick outlined, the water tank in your mind. Prior to 2018, the city put a little more water in the top of the tank, but the benefits were really only changed for newer hires. So what was coming out the bottom was still draining the tank further down, and it was eventually going to go dry. With the reforms of 2018 that the city manager just described, the city is continuing to put in even more. Now the members are also have stepped forward and are putting in more at the top of the tank. And with the additional benefit changes, what's coming out the bottom has slowed enough that the tank is beginning to rise very, very slowly, but beginning to rise and refill again. So that's kind of the difference of the path you were on and the path you're on now.
So this chart, even though it visually looks like things are going up, what's going up is the lower return rates. This is a chart that shows, so NASRA is National Association of State Retirement Administrators. This is a organization of statewide pension funds, okay? So not cities, but states, like Texas Teachers, Texas ERS is in there, Texas Municipal Retirement Fund, and all the other states around the country. And they do a nice survey of what their actuaries are assuming for, well, I'm sorry, what the funds are assuming, usually based on the advice of their actuaries for the return. And as you can see in 2001, the left-hand bar, you know, the median was 8%. You know, a handful were assuming the peach bars on the top, even better than 8%. Some were even assuming better than 8.5%. And very few were assuming as little as 7%. Looks like maybe only 1 or 2 funds, that tiny blue sliver on the lower left. But as time has passed since then, particularly as bond market has changed, you know, interest rates have changed. I don't know what a 30-year mortgage was in 2001, but I promise you it was a lot higher rate than it is today, even today. As the reality that low discount rates are here to stay, that gradually started growing. And more of these funds are now lowering their rates down to 7%, 6.5%, even some are below 6%. That's what these bars here are. So the trend has been that the pension funds are realizing it's unrealistic to think you can earn 8, unrealistic to think you can earn 7.5, and they're moving down. So you right now, your fund is right in the middle of the pack right now. I think that, as we mentioned before, if inflation kind of sticks in the bond market, not just the amount reported every month by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, but if the bond market starts thinking inflation is here to stay, and right now they're thinking it's going to be about 3%, but let's say they start thinking it's going to be 4%. Then there might be pressure back the other way where maybe your 7% could raise. But I would be stunned if very many pension funds around the country think that their rates should start creeping back up. You know, maybe the ones at 6 might creep up to 7, but I would be very surprised if any other funds around the country would consider raising a return rate that's 7 above that. So I think, I mean, hopefully we're wrong and we'll earn more than 7. And if that's the case, like David said, those lines, that line we saw in the prior graph will kind of phase down to look like the 7.5 line. But unless that happens, that's not likely, in my opinion. And then the last, I guess this is one of our last slides. Basically, we've got good news and bad news, or headwinds and tailwinds, I guess is a better way to put it. We had 3 great years of investment return that, as I mentioned before, are not baked in the cake yet. $219 million of them. And if that sticks, if we could earn 7% on the money we had back on January 1st and keep earning 7% on that, then we're in better shape to the tune of $200 million. So that 2.2 is really 2.0, let's say. The bad news is, of course, is you see the third bullet from the bottom, and it's even worse today. Markets have done very poorly so far in 2022. You're down about 2.5%. You're probably down another 2.5%, 3% just in April, based on what the general markets have done. So, you know, that's going to use up a lot of that $219 million. And that's the second bullet towards the top. Even if you lose 1% for the year, so if you go from -5 back to -1 by the end of the year, realistic possibility, you know, you'll have spent all the $219 million that's kind of built in. When they raised the rate, lowered the rate from 7.5 to 7, you could say they raised the bar, but they also kind of lowered the bar of what you got to return to not have bad news. In other words, they said you need more money, but now we don't need to earn as much money. So that is hopefully good. You're not in the situation many funds in where you're still being optimistic. Your other experience has been pretty good, and your unfunded liability has been pretty stable. Remember that bar chart? We were flat for the last 3 years. You know, that's due to your painful reforms. The headwinds, as I mentioned before, the market was at an all-time high 3 months ago or 4 months ago. You've got the big investment risk. Inflation is good for the actuarial assumptions, but in the short run, it can be brutal. You know, the bonds in particular, if inflation picks up, the value of your bonds go down. Businesses, if they think they're going to have inflation, they think they're going to have labor costs go up, the stock prices can go down. COVID obviously can be bad for the markets. The Ukraine conflict can have big problems. The actuary is planning to review the assumptions in 2 years. Next year. It's possible they will find other bad news. That, you know, maybe people are retiring earlier than they think. Maybe people are living longer than they think. So every once in a while, the actuaries adjust these assumptions, and we don't know how that's going to turn out. And then the 7% assumption of investment returns is, as you saw before, it's only about average. It's not better than average. And
I think I have this one. So this is our last slide. The good news is we're compliant with the Texas Pension Review Board. The other good news is what we started in motion 4 years ago has, if you think about the old discount rate, has exceeded what we put in motion. That's a good news piece. If you had to say what the challenges are, we're still over the 30-year amortization goal. And we're going to meet at the end of the month with the Pension Review Board, our what do you call those, Board of Trustees. And again, they'll have some of the same information. My recommendation is we implement the 5th year of the recommendations that have been put into motion. And really, it's this time next year, when we review where we are, the question's gonna be, do we need to take steps from that point forward? I don't think we're at that point right now, right? Because we're gonna go into the 5th year of the recommendations. But this time next year, so May of 2023, that's our time to review where we are, what the amortization level is, whether the slope is still declining. And then those questions will come back to the city council at that time to say, is there anything we need to do more at that point? So that's your 1-year warning on when we really have to come back and look at what we're gonna do about the pension. With that, questions?
So pending any disruption in the market, which I know is very difficult to, right, you don't want to guess, but based on current assumptions at 7% and the changes that have been made and the upcoming changes we'll make for final risk sharing in 2023, do you anticipate the need for this council to make additional contributions from the city side and/or go to employees again to bring that unfunded liability where it needs to be?
I mean, I think there are, of course, always policy decisions embedded in that, and judgment calls that are, yours, of course, to make, not ours. So if the trends as of the end of the last calendar year continue, you are on a path to pay down the liability within the 40-year time frame that, as a grandfathered plan, the Pension Review Board expects of you. You're making progress. You've turned it around and are slowly heading in the right direction. The policy calls involve whether you're doing it fast enough, because 37 years is slower than would be recommended. It's slower than what a bond rating agency would want to see. It's slower than what the Pension Review Board expects for new plans entering into difficulty. And balancing out, the costs of making greater progress faster and what the opportunity costs are of that increased investment and those changes. Those are, of course, judgments you all would have to weigh. You're on a exponentially better path than you were on prior to the 2018 actions. You're not moving quite as fast down that path as you would ideally want to be.
Thank you. And then the other question I had was maybe for David, and it doesn't require a lot of explanation, but I wanted you to describe for the newer council members, you attempted to make a calculation when you first started raising questions about the pension solvency. And there was a lot of discussion at the time about why not split the fund and new employees become 401k employees. And I want you to describe why we didn't do that. It's very simple. The math didn't work, right? But I think it's important for those to understand why we made that decision.
I imagine we did it more clearly before, but I'm gonna
That's
try to
okay,
fake it
yeah.
again. It essentially means that we will run 2 systems simultaneously, which means we would have to set up a fund for the new employees, but we would still have to put into place the financing for everything you just saw, right? So we'd have to run parallel systems for a period of time. Now, at some point in time, that might be the right thing to do, but at the time, if finances are tough, it's hard to set up parallel retirement plans at the same time.
Yeah. And I mentioned that just because I know sometimes I've gotten that question, why aren't you like the private sector? Why don't you put everybody on a 401k? And it's much more complicated than I think the average person understands as to why and what it took to get us to this place. So, thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Council, any other questions? No?
I would just add on that the Social Security element is the big deal, is that
Yeah.
our
Not,
employees.
yeah, employees are not getting Social Security, yeah.
So we, as a defined benefit plan, and that's why we do this.
Yeah. And as they take their seats, thank y'all very much. Just a reminder, we're a city that's independent pension. We're not part of TMRS. And so sometimes you hear that discussion too, employees, they can't port over their pension plan from another Texas city if it was a part of TMRS. Your larger cities really have their own independent pension plan, but sometimes that comes up when we're trying to attract talent from other cities. It is what it is, you can't change it, but you may hear about that as well. Thank you very much, David. I don't think that was that dry. I think it was good. Now we're gonna talk budget.
All right, good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Mark McAvoy from Planning and Data Analytics.
This is not that bad. They're already talking. It's not gonna be that bad, is it, Mark? It's just a schedule.
Yeah, is all of this in honor of Carrie's last work session, that he's just doing this to us before he leaves?
As we originally planned this, I think it was going to be right at 55 minutes. We're going to try to shave it to 52. No, this is just a preview of the schedule and what's coming, and just give you kind of an idea of some of the public outreach efforts that we have planned going into the budget season. And one thing that I'll point out at the beginning before we get into the slides is we talk about this a lot internally. Although there is a defined period of time, which you'll see on the next slide, of when we're formally in the budget making process, we consider the engagement and the outreach piece to be a year-round endeavor. And so we're doing a variety of different things at all times to outreach and to engage the public. But as we go into this defined period of budget making, we'll be doing these specific things that you'll see in just a moment. And so we're gonna talk about the calendar, the specific elements of public outreach, and then brief schedule of meetings that will adjust as we go forward and set specific dates and times for certain things. And so as you can see, the calendar starting essentially next week, second week of May, going out to the fourth week of September. You've got a variety of activities there with the public outreach campaign spanning that entire period. That doesn't mean that there's something different going on every day or every piece of that, every block of that span, but we have a variety of things that I'll talk about in some detail in just a few minutes across that entire, 18-week period. Then we have stakeholder meetings that we have scheduled to happen once a month between May and August. We have budget town halls, a collection of those happening in June. City Council takes its annual break in July. We will resume the town halls in August. Then we have the city manager's budget presentation currently slated for either the first or second week in August. City Council workshops the second and fourth week of August. And then we get into the formal statutorily required process where we go through budget and tax rate public hearings and the budget and tax rate adoption ultimately happening that last week in September as it's currently scheduled. And so looking at some of the outreach that we're gonna be planning, this is a new thing that we wanted to just kind of describe. We're not gonna go into a tremendous amount of detail here. But what we would like to do is to give everyone in the city at least the opportunity to provide input to the budget process. And so what we're going to do, and we're gonna launch this next week, is something that we would invite residents to do, encourage them to do, is to go out and to take photographs around town and to send us those photographs of things that they would include in budget prioritization talks, right? So this is a fun activity. Anybody can participate. And this is something that I don't know that we've not done in the past, but certainly over the past couple of years, we've not done anything like this. And so this is certainly one of those things that we wanted to bring to your attention this afternoon. And then we get into the more standard types of outreach. We will have a variety of different scheduled social media and e-newsletter types of communication, things going out on all of the social media channels. We're going to promote all of these things that we just talked about, the meetings, the town halls, the workshops. And then we're going to leverage the already existing community engagement bulletins and the faith-based bulletins that we publish. Along with that, our plan is to put together a series of video snippets on different aspects of the budget process, the budget making, how the proposed budget is put together, the adoption of the budget, why it matters, those kinds of things, the tax rate, how that's derived, all of those different aspects of budget making that we'll be getting into over this next 4-month period. Media relations, different kinds of press releases, conversations with the editorial board. We have a specific, I mentioned before, series of stakeholder meetings that we would host between now and August, reaching out to various sectors of the city, chambers of commerce, all of these things that you see listed here, ISDs, the real estate council, all of these different groups that would have an interest in knowing what's going on as we develop the budget for fiscal '23. Of course, the city's website will be updated and there will be a specific fiscal 2023 budget webpage that will have all of the pertinent information, the schedules, everything will be kept up to date. Citizens can also provide feedback through the website at this email address that will be part of all of our outgoing communications. In addition to that, staff will be available at all of these varieties of types of public meetings that don't come through the city, community groups, neighborhood associations, HOAs, all of those kinds of things. City staff would be available to address any budget-related items that may come up. And then I mentioned before the public meetings, stakeholder meetings, those will be at City Hall. The town hall meetings, we would propose to have those out in the districts like we have in the past. The budget work sessions here, budget and tax rate public hearings, which will happen at city council meetings here, and then ultimately the budget and tax rate adoption at City Hall as well. Schedule of meetings, these are the ones right now, these are the formal meetings, these are the ones that really are the meat and potatoes of the budget making process. Like I said before, it either is going to be the first or second week in August when the city manager's presentation of the recommended budget will occur, and that includes both the CIP, the annual operating budget, and the presentation of the CCPD funding application. We have a series of 4 city council budget work sessions planned for the 11th and 12th and 25th and 26th. And then the schedule, and these are the statutory elements here, September 13th, the public hearing for the budget, September 27th, the tax rate public hearing, and then also on September 27th, the FY23 budget and tax rate adoption. So that's essentially the preview that we wanted to provide. And with that, just a reminder that some of these dates, times, and locations will be shored up as we go through the calendar and get not only more information, but we make decisions. And then folks should be reminded to stay tuned to all of our channels to get the most up-to-date information about all of these things that we've just talked about. And that was short and sweet, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have about the upcoming budget schedule.
I have some questions and or concerns about the budget process. And obviously, we've only been through one, and last year, those of us that were new admittedly didn't really know what was happening. We were drinking from a fire hose, a lot of us. It was our first time, and we had stepped in when the process was almost over. Through conversations with previous council members, I've learned that we used to do it a little differently. And I think that there needs to be some discussion about what role the council plays in developing these budgets. I'm of the firm opinion that our budget is how we speak to policy in a city. It's how we set our priorities. We can choose to spend it all on roads, or we can spend it all on public safety, but that's really a policy position for those of us here on council. And when I look at this calendar and I look at this schedule, it seems like council's an afterthought towards the end. We're given a budget proposal. I appreciate all the stakeholder engagement and the town halls, but we're given the budget, and this is the recommendation, and I think there needs to be just some discussion beforehand on where we are and what we would like to see as policy in that budget. For example, our street striping, which we heard about today, could be something that only Councilman Beck is concerned with, and that's not really gonna make it into the budget, but as a collective group, we could decide that it's worth not reducing the tax rate or not paying for something else in the budget, or however we want to make that work to put that forward. And so I'd like to see some council engagement much earlier in the process so that we can really be part of that.
Yes, ma'am, I've got that noted here, and we'll.
Any other questions, council? Nope. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you
Appreciate
all,
it.
appreciate it.
I think that's the last of our presentations, yes. Do we have any future agenda items, council? Elizabeth?
Alleys seem to be a persistent issues, alleys and sidewalks in the city. And so I think two separate IRs on the funding sources, the departments related to the upkeep and maintenance of both alleys, separately alleys and sidewalks. And I'd also like to know what best practices are, what other cities are doing to take care of those particular amenities in the city.
Carrie?
Not really a future agenda item, just kind of let my colleagues know some conversations that are happening in District 4 and specifically with Trinity Metro and Directions Home and challenges that we, District 4 residents, are having with camps along our bus routes along North Beach. And we have met with Trinity Metro. We had a meeting, a neighborhood meeting last week. It was very well attended. We had over 150 residents attend. We had, appreciate Steve Montgomery and Datra Whitmore and Tara Perez all coming to participate in that and hearing firsthand the concerns from the residents. We have, obviously, the 76244 zip code is the most densely populated zip code in all of DFW area. And that growth is, come without the support of transit, and we had attempted to add transit to that. We are seeing the sales tax success of Presidio and Alliance, and we're seeing the job center coming in 2025 with Alliance Airport, just a growing area. But transit hasn't really picked up, and the one route that we have along Beach, we've met with them to ask them to replace that route with some type of zip zone or van pool, because of when the studies we've done show that the camping challenges are heavy along the bus route and not everywhere in North Fort Worth. So know that conversation is coming to my council members that are on the Trinity Metro board. For instance, we have one bus that stops at a specific bus stop 21 times a day and only has 7 boarding and lightings throughout the day. So in the end, we want to try to address that need with other more fiscal sound resources and save with the challenges we're having with camping along that route.
Thank you. Michael?
I just have one here. Starting to get a lot of complaints about the Fort Worth ISD is contracted with Dickies for the for parking or for the graduation ceremonies. I'd just like to understand a little bit more what say we do or don't have over that process, especially with big public ceremonies like that.
Yeah, and maybe, I was gonna say, you may need to do something quicker because graduations are now. There's been a lot of question and concern. We've gotten a lot. It's very difficult to explain to people. Some school districts are gonna contract with Dickies directly to pay for the parking in one big contract to keep parents from having to do so. But that's not the choice of every school district. And I know each of you are getting questions. So our office can also work with David's to get you an answer. It's not gonna be helpful, honestly. It's still expensive and we have nothing to do with it. It's contractual between the school districts and Dickies Arena directly.
I think that the quick answer is Fort Worth ISD has chosen not to pay for the parking as part of their agreement. Is that the answer that we're getting to? Some school districts have when they contract, but it sounds like Fort Worth ISD has chosen not to.
Okay. That's my understanding.
Yes. Yes. Any other future agenda items? No? Okay, we're adjourned. Thank y'all.